Pray, God, speak to our hearts this morning. May we hear you in the voices of others. May we hear you through me or in spite of me today. May we walk with you in our Lenten journey. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen. When I was young, I used to believe that children were born pure and innocent. Then at the age of 27, I became a parent. Now, I believe in original sin. Just one example. When my son John, the oldest son, was about 4 years old, I was outside our home in Camden, Maine, doing some yard work one day. I took John outside to play while I raked the leaves, and holding his hand, I knelt down beside him so that we could look each other face to face. And I said to him, slowly and carefully, I said, John, you can play here in the front yard. You can go next door and visit our neighbor. You can pull your wagon in the driveway. You can go in the backyard and play on your swing set. You can stay here and help me rake the leaves. You can even go back inside and play with your toys or watch television. Only one thing you are not to do. You cannot go out into the street. It is very dangerous there. Cars do not pay attention to little boys playing in the street. So you cannot play in the street. Do you understand me? And John solemnly nodded his head and said, yes, Mommy. So I smiled at him, and I let go of his hand. And you guessed it, he ran straight to the edge of our yard, put one foot right in the street, and looked at me. You foolish mortal. And that's when I knew how God must have felt in the Garden of Eden. What part of no do we not understand? What is there in our genetic makeup that seems to be preoccupied with whatever is denied? What is it that ignores the tremendous amount of freedom that we enjoy in our lives and instead focuses on the limitations? What makes us rebel against those limits? We certainly did not learn that from studying the life of Jesus. Does the devil make us do it, as Flip Wilson would have us think? The devil was certainly trying hard with Jesus in our gospel story, our gospel song today. Today is the first Sunday of the season of Lent, the first day that officially doesn't count in our 40 days of Lent. Sundays are always considered feast days for Christians, joyous, celebratory days used to remember the death and the resurrection of Jesus Christ, so they are not included in the penitent time of preparation for Easter. So some people use Sundays as cheat days. I have a niece who actually sees it that way. And I actually found a site on the web that talked about that. So that any Lenten promises you have made can be ignored on Sundays. Well, I don't know about you, but to me that's a bit of a fuzzy line, and I prefer not to cross it, but to each his or her own. Speaking of fuzzy lines, our theme during this Lenten season is going to be the 7 deadly sins. And sometimes we like to fuzz the lines of those a little bit. The 7 deadly sins are 7 things that separate us from our relationship with God. 7 things extremely easy to fall into. I want to begin by telling you that there is no place in the Bible where you will find these 7 deadly sins listed. You will not be able to look in a concordance or a commentary under deadly sins and find them. In the Middle Ages, in an attempt to better understand our relationship with God, a group of Christians searched through the Bible and came up with this list of sins. It groups together those things that separate us from God and from one another. Thus the name deadly, because of the fatal separation in our relationship with God, as well as with other people, and even with ourselves, with our own souls, that comes about because of these sins. Each of the next 5 weeks we will take a look into 1 or 2 of these 7 deadly sins. So let me list them for us. Some will be old friends for each one of us. This list seems to cover most of our shortcomings. Those of you who were here on Ash Wednesday will recognize the definitions. Pride, an excessive belief in one's own abilities that interferes with the individual's recognition of the grace of God. It has been called the sin from which all others arise. Pride is also known as vanity. Envy, the desire for others' traits, status, abilities, or situation. Gluttony, an inordinate desire to consume more than what one requires. Lust, an inordinate craving for the pleasures of the body. Anger, anger is made manifest in the individual who rejects love and chooses instead fury. It's also known as wrath. Greed, we have fingers. Greed is the desire for material wealth or gain, ignoring the spiritual. It's also called avarice or covetousness. And sloth is the avoidance of physical or spiritual work. This is also called acedia, the 7 deadly sins. On March 9th of 2008, the Vatican newspaper published a list of 7 modern social sins. The list appeared in a CNN interview with Monsignor Gianfranco Girardi, who suggested that they were new sins which have appeared on the horizon of humanity as a corollary to the unstoppable process of globalization. In some cases, the media erroneously reported this list as a modern replacement for the original 7, but I want to suggest that there is a connection to the original 7, but we have not mastered those 7. The modern social sins: destroying the environment, related to sloth and greed. Genetic manipulation from envy and pride. Obscene wealth, gluttony, lust, greed. Creating poverty, greed and gluttony. Drug trafficking, lust, greed, sloth. Immoral scientific experimentation from pride and envy. And violation of the fundamental rights of human nature, anger and lust and pride. In the Bible, beginning with the first pages and the story of Adam and Eve, we see our humanity in their rebellion toward God. Just like my son John, Adam and Eve turned their back on God. And as a result, they and we too are marked with mortality. Later, their son Cain slays his brother Abel, and he too is punished. In fact, throughout the scriptures, there is a picture of humanity that is reflected still in our world today. A picture of willful rebellion against God. Sinful disobedience, a desire to do our own thing, and to parade our goodness in front of others to hide the mark of sin upon us. So this week, I'll begin with one of those 7 deadly sins that's often associated with the season of Lent: gluttony. As we list these 7 deadly sins, remembering that they are fatal in our relationship with Christ, we will put a nail in the cross each time that we do that. Charlie, would you do that honors, please? Frequently when we decide to give something up for Lent, it has to do with denying ourselves some kind of food. Choosing to fast a certain day or a certain time of day during the season of Lent. Gluttony is defined as the mad pursuit of the bodily pleasures that never completely satisfy. We connect it with the craving for food, particularly the craving for things like dessert, as we heard in our play this morning. That's its primary expression. But the person who smokes or drinks too much can be as gluttonous as the one who eats too much. Those who pursue wealth, above all else, could also be considered gluttonous, taking in more than they need, to the detriment of themselves and of others, and thus obscene wealth. The sin of gluttony could also be called the sin of self-indulgence, and I challenge each one of us to find ourselves the exception to the sin of self-indulgence. I find myself there. So as I talk about gluttony, think about what else besides food that you allow yourself to be self-indulgent about. Or how is it that we, especially in America, chase after obscene wealth? In our gospel lesson today, Jesus' temptation to turn rocks into bread was suggestive of gluttony. Eating food is a necessity of life. We need food to live. We need food to be able to do our work. We use food as a way to be sociable, likable people. For the average person, statistics say that at least 20% of the day is consumed by thinking about, shopping for, preparing, eating, and cleaning up after food. A recent poll indicated that 2 out of 3 people in the U.S. are considered overweight. In many countries, in fact, anyone who's overweight is considered to be an American. But the sin of gluttony is about more than good or poor eating habits. Ultimately, gluttony is about making food such a central concern in our lives that the time we spend thinking about food and dealing with food pushes other more important matters aside. The sin of gluttony is making food into a god. Food is allowed to define who we are. It's looked at as a way to solve or relieve the burden of our problems, or to simply ignore them. Of course, we have to think about eating to some extent. Particularly as Americans, we are bombarded by food on all sides. Nearly every street corner has some kind of food available for us. Partly to cut down the amount of time consumed by food, a lot of families will eat out. A Gallup poll indicates that the average family eats 40% of its meals out of the home, while some families eat as much as 70% of their meals outside of the home. In fact, for some families, so many meals are eaten outside of the home that when mom and dad say it's time to eat, the children run to their closet to get their coats. Gluttony around food is not only a personal sin, it's also a social sin, because we as a society create the temptations that lead us into the danger zone. We are bombarded every day by messages in the newspaper, on television about food and drink. We drive down the road and all we see are places to get something to eat. The sheer variety of food in the grocery store is staggering. Just look down the cereal aisle, how many choices there are. Curiously, while we get all these messages to eat more, we also are told by the very same media that being thin is beautiful. So we are given a double message that centers on food. Our children are also given the message that food is the way to be happy. Just look at the commercials in children's television. Here, children, eat this and you'll be happy. The Bible itself is filled with stories that use food as a way to express our relationship with God. Eating the wrong food was the reason that Adam and Eve were cast out of paradise. The very first sin concerned the desire to eat. When God promised the Israelites the promised land, it was called the land of milk and honey, flowing with milk and honey. A land abundant in food, all ready to eat. The Israelites responded to that, okay, let's go. Esau sold his birthright to Jacob for a bowl of bean soup. And then Jacob received Esau's blessings by tricking his father over a pot of stew. Israel was sustained in the wilderness with manna and quail. And then the people rebelled against God because the food that they remembered eating back in Egypt, the melons and vegetables and the roasted meats. They turned against God because of food. The Old Testament prophets spoke out against those who were well fed, while outside their doors the poor went hungry. Food was an occasion for the judgment of God. In the New Testament, when Jesus talked about life in heaven, he often described it as being a great banquet where you join with others to eat. Again, food is a part of our relationship with others. It can be a joy. For Jesus, eating with others was a sign that anyone for whom life is empty, God will fill it with grace and acceptance and meaning. The act of fasting is a particularly important expression in the Bible in our relationship with God. Most people think of fasting as starving yourself to misery, like the characters in our skit did at first. But in the Bible, fasting is always related to prayer. It helps us to focus on God by disciplining our bodies and our minds and our spirits. It is about focusing on God and the things of God. In the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus talked about fasting as part of being one of his followers. Jesus encouraged us to fast so that we could focus our attention on God. But Jesus also encouraged us to feast so that we could focus on God. There's a time to fast, but there is also a time to feast, particularly to invite others into the feast of God. I think of Jesus sometimes as a real party animal. You think of all the times that he got together with others to eat. He would go and eat with the most self-righteous in the community, hypocritical people. And then the next night he could be found eating with the worst of sinners in the same town. All this eating earned Jesus a reputation of being a glutton and a drunkard. But you see, Jesus knew that in eating with people, you share yourself and God's blessings. Eating with others is a time of close communion. Eating itself is not gluttony. It's when we use that food to separate us from others and from God. At the end, Jesus gave us a memorial to remind us of who he is and what his life was about in the breaking of bread and the drinking from the cup. Remember what happened to the disciples in the inn at Emmaus? It was when Jesus broke the bread that they recognized him in the breaking of bread together. Eating food with others is a time of communion, a holy time, when we are nourished not only physically but spiritually, a time when Christ is present. There is a time to fast, and there is a time to feast. But we look neither to the food of our fasting nor the food of our feasting for abundant life. That's not where it is found. We look instead to God